Welcome back to Global Business Night with Gibson Odoka Jr. I'm super excited to have you here today. Last time we talked about how millionaires or how to operate business like a millionaire. The reason we talked about that was because there was this ongoing, I don't want to say it's a knowledge gap, but a lot of people want to be millionaire business people, but they are operating business like peasants, right? Just like we have in agriculture what we call peasant farmer, someone who farms and when they farm strictly for their immediate consumption or for the consumption of their immediate family. We also have peasant businessman, and peasant businessman is basically an individual or a business that operates strictly to make enough money for daily survival or just to cater for family needs, not like the basic family needs. So, and I understood like a lot of people want to, be millionaires, especially in Africa where people are super in Africa, people are super ambitious, so they want to operate business as millionaires. But a lot of people just have the knowledge gap, and it's cost a lot of people so much. So, in the last episode, some of the things we talked about, like some of the factors or the key differences in business registration. As a peasant businessman, businesses are not generally registered. They just open a business or open a shop and start running it like that. There's no business registration. They just run like that, and for them, that's okay. And for most people, it's not really okay. It's just that they don't have the knowledge. So that's why um, I have to bring it up, and it's one of the key difference. Those who want to, operate like millionaires, they um, register their business, and and in terms of registering business, we're not just talking about business name registration. It's a lot different from incorporating or getting your business limited, right? If you want to operate business like a millionaire, you have to take your business, you have to incorporate your business, not just a business name registration. You have to either incorporate it or, depending on the country where you are, you can make it a limited entity. So that way you can operate business at any level, right? So number 210 is have a business account. Well, unfortunately, you can't have a business account if your business is not registered. All right. And now here's the thing with business account. If your business is not registered, you can have a business account with a bank. All right. So there was this my in-law that my dad was talking to. He had a logistic company, and also he's into dredging, so he had some tippers, right? So my dad was, in the course of the conversation, my dad's like, yo, like you're making good money, but you can 10x this, whatever you're making, right? And you can also start doing interstate business. So one of the things he was asking him to do is to register the business and get a business account, because at the time his transactions, like all his money, were coming into his personal account, and it doesn't make sense, right? Like if as a businessman, you have a business account with a bank. One of the things that the bank notices, the moment well, bank itself, right? Like it's actually bank as a business operates on loan, like giving loan. They operate by making interest. So when people put their money in the bank as individuals or as business, what the bank do is to use that money to give to businesses, so the businesses can transact with their funds, and then they pay them interest in return. All right. So now, as a businessman who is aspiring to be a millionaire, if you have a business account, what the bank do, so long as they keep seeing your transaction, they would know that this person is reliable, that there's consistent inflow, so they would easily or willingly, offer you a business loan. And I've heard a lot of people say banks don't give loan. That's not true. The reason they don't give loan to you is because you don't have a business account that is functional, that is having daily inflow of funds. The moment banks see that, they are rest assured that you can, repay loan. They'll give you loan and you can build your business at a larger scale. And almost every millionaire businessman you see there are on loan. It's not like loan is not a bad thing, it's just perspective. At times you take loan to build your business, to buy more tools, buy more equipment, for expansion purposes and all that. So the next thing we talked about too was branding. Like every person who wants to operate business like a millionaire must brand. I've seen a lot of people who go about building a brand on Instagram, on Facebook, and for some weird reason, they get good recognition. But here's the thing, right? Like you can't, um, you can't survive with that, right? Like you have to get a proper branding done, and in order to do that, it still takes you back to registering your business. Because imagine if you have a business name, like a business that's already people have known properly, and then you now go for a business name registration, like to incorporate your business, and they're telling you the name is not available, which happens in most cases. Now, there are people whose job is to look out for businesses that are doing very well. There are people who just go out looking for businesses that are doing well but are not registered. They register just that business name and also buy the domain name. That way, when the individual who wants to use that business name, go to register, they will have to come to them and they sell them that same business name at a lot higher price. That's if they even want to sell. Right, I got to know this when I registered my first business, because my first company, I used the service of a law firm, a legal entity. And when I gave them, it cost me a lot of money, about $2,700. And what happened was, the first name I submitted, we checked it, it wasn't available. Another business, like someone actually bought the name. The business, like there's no business on that, they just bought the name because they knew that somebody might want to use it, right? Somebody might want to use that business name. So in that process, my lawyer was like, well, we can go negotiate with this person, which would be a lot more expensive, and he didn't advise that. It would be a lot of expenses, or we just get a new business name. So imagine if you've got like a brand around your business on Instagram, or on TikTok, and now you're going to register your business, right? And the name has already been taken. There's a lot, yeah, like there's a lot of problems. So you don't want that to happen to you, right? And on the list again, we have emails, right? Like you have to make sure every conversation that go on in your company between your business people, like your staffs, with other people, have to be centered with, or has to go through your registered domain email. So if your company is geneva.com, right, and I'm working there, whatever conversation I'm having should be Gibson at geneva.com, right? So that's what it should be. And also there should be a time for research. Well, yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here because you should go watch that episode. It's really packed, and yeah, it's a lot of information. You should go watch that episode so we can get into this business, which is how the 19th century millionaires made their money. Now, somebody would say, what do you mean by how the 19th century millionaires made their money? Well, they made their wealth using or following the universal truth, which is the world runs by need. This is the universal truth for business. The world runs by need. And this dates to creation story. If you follow the creation story, you would hear when the world was created, everywhere was dark, and void. So God wanted to build, like he wanted to, and the course of creation, he knew people won't be able to see to carry out the assignment he wants them to do. So he decided to, first of all, solve that problem of darkness. So what he did was to create light, and everywhere became bright, right? So you, as human, you have to follow the same principle. You have to follow the same principle. Notable American psychologist Abraham Maslow, once talked about the pyramids of human needs in the society, And in that pyramid of needs, pyramid basically, the top is pyramid is a triangle, you know, like this, and the top is usually less crowded, the bottom is a lot crowded. So in the pyramid of need, at the very bottom is what we call the psychological needs of human. These psychological needs of humans includes shelter, food, clothing, and the rest. So now, in this part, this is where a lot of people made their money, especially in the 19th century, right? Like, if you are living in Johannesburg, just imagine you're living in Johannesburg and you have to go to Johannesburg is in South Africa for some of you who don't know, and you have to go to Canada, let's say Toronto, for education. How do you get to Toronto? Well, or okay, let's just put it this way. Say you already have a house in Johannesburg and you're moving to Toronto to study at the University of Toronto. You can't move your house from South Africa to Toronto, so you would need a house, right? So you have to rent a house when you get to Toronto. House shelter is a universal need. So somebody out in Toronto or up in Toronto will create that need for, or like solve that problem for you, right? So that is basically how you know the world runs. It's all about needs. Once you're able to understand this, for people who are traveling for short time traveling, most people stay in hostels, right? And sorry, not hostel, like hotel. Yeah, a lot of people stay in hotel. So when you stay in hotel, hotels are not very convenient for long time travelers. So it's a lot better for short time travelers, right? So somebody have to provide that hotel for people. And then if a backpacker, what a lot of backpackers do, they stay in hotels, in hostels. So when they stay in hostels, the hostels are usually cheaper than hotels. So I used to love using them a lot when I travel, and it's just fun, right? Like you meet other backpackers, you share knowledge and explore the city together. So, but then in our recent time, right? Like we saw people who even went a little further. They discovered when people travel, sometimes they get nostalgic about like not necessarily like they want to know more about where they are staying, so they came up with this concept of Airbnb, so that is air bed and breakfast, right? So in that, you travel to a particular place, you rent a room in the house of the local. They give you breakfast, and the advantage of that is enormous because you can actually get to know more about the place, from the local. You get to learn more about their food, about the community. If you have someone that's very friendly and very open-minded, they might show you a lot more stuff or tell you a lot more about the place than when you employ the service of a professional tour guide. Right. So the world runs by needs. Somebody have to provide these needs. In the 19th century, we have some pretty amazing individuals who focused on providing these needs for people. Notable among them is John Jacob Aston. This guy was a pretty interesting guy. He made his money from selling fur and opium to the Chinese Empire at the time, and also real estate. So now the four of a thing, right? Four is what people were using to make, clothes. Most of them animal skin to make belt, to make cap, and you name it. So he used this to make a lot of money. Even the opium he was selling to China. Now this is a little awkward because China at the time didn't need opium, right? They didn't need it, but because China was selling a lot of stuff to Britain, right? So like China was selling a lot of products to Britain, porcelain, tea, and all that. So suddenly the Britain decided, you know what, we are having trade imbalance, and they wanted trade balance between them and China. So they didn't have anything to give to sell to China. However, they decided to start selling opium, to China, and that didn't really go well because they had like two opium wars, in 1839 and 1856. They had two very strong opium wars, but it is what it is, right? Like those guys were able to um, make money from it. At some point, the Chinese government would buy the opium and destroy them because they know these drugs are very addictive and it will cause harm, in their society, in their economy. So they buy and destroy them instead of letting their citizens get to use them. Another person, like, notice what I'm trying to say here. Like, this whole stuff is centered around needs, how the world really works by need. Right? Like, another person was Andrew Carnegie. He's a Scottish guy who is Scottish immigrants to America, right? So he, during the American Civil War, you know, that's I don't want to go into his backstory, but his parents moved into America, and then he got hired by after his first job. He later got a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, and from there, he learned a lot. And then during the American Civil War, he had made some money. He realized there is a big issue, with the troops. The they discovered that this thing was going off really fast. Like people, the bridge. Then back then they used wooden bridge, to they use wooden bridge. They are very reliable bridges. But then he discovered the troops were able to burn the bridges, and that didn't really make sense. So he decided to come up with another system, which was to build a steel bridge. Right, steel bridges, which are a lot more durable and a lot more quality and durable. But the interesting thing about this guy, instead of just building the bridge, he formed a triad of a company. A triad is basically like a triangle of a company. So he had, since he's dealing with steel, he knew he has to deal with the suppliers of iron, which he wanted to boycott because that would kill his profits. So he had to form a iron mining extraction company that supplies his bridge building company steel, and then he also sells rail rails for building railroad or coaches. So he yeah, like that's just a lot of like there's a lot to that his story, but it's quite interesting because he was able to solve that need. He understood the world runs by need, and at a time later years he decided to sell his company after he made a lot of money to J.P. Morgan for about $480 million, and that made him the richest man in the world. Later on he used his fortune to do goodwill. He also was a philanthropist. He built like over 2,500 libraries across cities in the world. But J.P. Morgan too was one of the guys who made a lot of money in the 19th century by solving people's problem, which was financing businesses. His dad was a banker, and then he later broke out from through those experiences. And if you go over his history, you would learn a lot more about it. For the sake of this video, I won't go in depth, but he was able to do something meaningful for himself, and he was financing most of those businesses, especially in the time of rail construction, train like railroad construction. He financed so many businesses, including that of I think he financed the Cornelius Vanderbilt business, because yeah, even this Morgan, he's one of the guys that's actually he is the key player in the U.S. Federal Reserve, which serves as a central bank. So he financed a lot of people, including the likes of Vanderbilt, who, when he was 16, he's also an American guy. When he was 16 in the 19th century, he took $100 loan from his mom, and he was able to buy boats. Right at the time, the major means of transportation was boats. People traveled by water. He bought a lot of boats, and he was, you know, um, helping people transport their goods and also themselves across cities through water in order to like he was helping them transport that, and he was making a lot of money. But here is when his breakthrough came. There was a major need for boats because he initially he was reinvesting his profits, so he was able to buy a lot more boats. So in um, there was a U.S. Britain war. I think that was in 1812 when Britain and U.S. had a war. So they needed a lot of boats to transport troops, across for the war. So they had to. The government went on contract with him to supply that, and he made an insane amount of money. So he later went on to buy steamboats when things evolved, and then he's a very ruthless business guy, right? There was this story where he wanted to launch into Hudson River, and the people there was like, no, 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 we can't let. I think the dominant company was ah, uh, um, the Steamboat Association, something like that. Yeah, Steamboat Association. They had to pay $100,000 so he can just shift. Like they don't want him to come in there to do business because they knew the moment he comes in there, he has all the advantages. He has a lot of boats. He would drop his price very low to the point nobody will be able to compete. So they just had to pay him off. He's that kind of guy. So, but he's also a pretty good guy in research. So at the time, right, like a lot of people were, for you to go to California, people were traveling through Panama, right? And he knew, from his research, he discovered there's actually a shorter way to get to California, and that is through going to Nicaragua, all right? So he had to sign an agreement with the Nicaraguan government that like an agreement to give him a monopoly on that route. Like nobody else would use that route. His boats are the only ones allowed to use that route at the time. And people wanted to get quicker, they want short means of transportation instead of going through Panama, which is a lot longer. So they had to start using a service, and he made a lot of money until much later in the story, I think he later had problem with his people who he entrusted with when he traveled, and then, but it's just one of those things. But he was trying to solve need. It still goes back to what we were talking about. The world runs on need. He later got into rail construction because he discovered what the movement were not beginning to move from water transportation to um, rail. People were transporting goods and services more through train, through train is a lot more convenient and quicker. So he decided to, well, not necessarily quicker, but it's a lot convenient and safer. So he decided to venture into rail construction, and he built so much. He built a lot of railroads, and he made insane amount of money. But the whole point is he was trying to solve a problem, which is transportation problem, transporting people, transporting goods. So the next person is John D. Rockefeller. He's an interesting fella, right? John D. Rockefeller was a great business guy, and he is more known for having Standard Oil, which is one of the biggest oil firm in the world, right? So the thing here is, when John D. Rockefeller started his own oil firm stuff, at the time there was no vehicles weren't really a thing. It was more of carriage, horse and carriages. So he was able to um, focus on um, sorry, at the time, petroleum, because he bought, after making some money, he bought oil well, and he, petroleum at the time, all people could use was kerosene. I was born in the 20th century, so we were using kerosene at the time. Kerosene is not much a deal now, but then we were using kerosene. So he hired the service of really smart chemists to work on the lab for him, and they were able to discover more use um, for petroleum. So when he discovered that, he had to double his efforts, got some more loans, and he was able to build a big refinery to the point he had to use some really strong pricing strategies to bring down his prices and then get people to get his competitors to sell their refineries to him. And at the time of his death, he was owning, I think he was in charge of over 90% of US oil refinery, all the oil refined in the United States. So it's crazy. That's just the way it is. If you've traveled around Canada properly, you would also notice that's how the economy is structured, right? Like in North America, precisely, right? Like most of the community colleges, one of the things they do pretty well, is to find a way to solve their immediate needs. So in Canada, at least I've spent quite a reasonable time, within the various Canadian coast. So in the East Coast is comprised is of four provinces: the New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, and okay, hold on, Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. Yeah, I got it. So one thing that's common in the east coast of Canada is they make sure they have like their community colleges or even some of their universities, focus on solving problems. The courses focus on solving problems that has to do with them. The east coast has a lot of oceans and beautiful beaches. So in terms of solving, in terms of programs they offer, you would be seeing stuff like marine science, aquatic sciences, um, pretty much things to do with the ocean, And then if you also go a little further to, sometimes, they branch out to what we call um, forestry because they have a lot of, forest too. And yeah, like they try to solve their immediate needs. One of the people in the East Coast, the families that really tapped into this, is called the Ivan family. They understood what people needed, so they control the oil and gas, they control timber, they're into politics, they're in media. So it's very vast. So they understood like what the people need in the East Coast, and they were willing to pay the price. They were resilient enough to go into entrepreneurship, especially the initial founder of their business. So it's just the way that works, right? If you take a little step to the west coast of Canada, west coast, I'm talking about the British Columbia, um, Saskatchewan. But Saskatchewan is west coast. But the example I'm trying to cite is more predominant in British Columbia and Alberta province. So these areas they have a lot of oil and gas. A lot of people, especially young people. Yeah, well, not just young people, but a lot of people work in the oil patch, oil field. So most of the courses you will find in their community colleges has to do with oil and gas. A lot of the courses they teach has to do with oil and gas. So it's just the way the world works. It's all about needs. If you're able to meet up with the needs of the society, you will make a lot of money. This is the principle the 19th century millionaires followed, and you that is in this 20th century, people in the 20th century followed the same exact principle, and they made a lot of money. We have the likes of what Disney, Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a 20th century millionaire. In the 21st century, like I talked about during the time of John D. Rockefeller, you know, the the use of petrol wasn't that enormous. It was strictly for kerosene purposes, which people who are born in the 20th century should know a lot about kerosene, you know. So not until they did more research and they discovered there's a lot of products that that come out of petroleum, and one of which became diesel or gasoline, which is used to power automotive, that became a common thing in the 20th century, you know. So yeah, it's just the way it is. It's the way it is. So you have to understand this principle. This is the principle that guides every business, principle that guides every economy. Those who make very big money, just take a look at your economy. Take a look at your environment. Understand those who make a lot of money. See, like the Trumps, they understood America is a place where a lot of immigrants, people are coming. America was seen as a symbol of prosperity, symbol of progress, and then a lot of people want to affiliate with America. So there are a lot of people who necessarily, they've made money in their country. They don't want to live in America, but they just want to have affiliation with America. This is also applicable in Canada, right? So they just buy houses, so they buy houses. They need that real estate. They need a house. They need something that will link them there. So somebody had to provide that need for them to be able to get that. So you have to do that. In the last in the last 6 years, yeah, pretty much 6 years, there was a very huge surge in Nigerians traveling overseas. There are people who tapped into the opportunity and started providing travel abroad services, travel abroad consulting, and they made huge amount of money. So all you need to do is to follow this same principle the 19th century businessmen or millionaires used to amass fortune, and put it in today, and you would get the same exact result. First of all, you have to be very, very vibrant. You got to be vibrant. You have to study your environment. You have to know what people need. There's some neighborhoods, when we go back to Maslow pyramids of need, some neighborhoods are yet, the people in those neighborhoods, they are still struggling with, the basic psychological needs, which is food, shelter, and clothing. You can't do a business that's meant for people who are in the second or third level in the pyramid and expect to make progress or expect to make money. So you have to understand what your society needs, what your economy needs, provide that, and you will make insane amount of money. There's no two way about it. So thank you very much for joining today's podcast. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you. I love you. Bye.